Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 146. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, November the 2nd, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. I have a guest in studio today. If you haven't heard of him, you must have been living under a rock if you're from the St. Louis area. His name is Mark Kasen. The guy has a past that's unbelievable. LA native. He was a stockbroker. He's an educator, radio host, television host. He's got a daily broadcast, Something's Happening. Is that the name?
That's the name that we're using right now. That's true. Because something is happening. That's for sure.
Something is happening. TalkSTL.net is your website.
That's correct.
But for many years, Mark was the co-host and business partner for a radio legend who I've mentioned many times on my podcast, Richard Onion Horton. He was a giant in radio in St. Louis. In my opinion, he was the original shock jock before there was a shock jock. He was a man who spoke his mind. I won't say he was the voice of the black community because I don't believe there is a black community. I think that folks just think for themselves, but he was very much a giant in broadcasting in the black community. And he was on many radio stations in this country, in this town, often with you. And you were his business partner and friend. And I wanted to have you on the radio just to talk about Richard Onion Horton, what he was about, what he did. I did a podcast about him, but I was a passive listener. And you were his buddy and business partner. So let's talk about Richard Onion Horton.
Sure. First off, I would say that Onion, and I told you this off the air a minute ago, Onion would have never accepted that shock jock description. He would have said that he simply tells things the way they are, and that it's, as you also said off the air, it's simple fact, and that's the way he sees it, and that's the way he was. There's no question that he got people very upset, certainly in the white community. Although he didn't hate white people. There was always this thing, Onion hates white people. And yet we were together for well over 20 years. And as people would often say to him, have you noticed Kasen's white? You know, and again, I know every Onion Horton story there is. I've been with him forever.
You were there for most.
All the way. And, you know, Onion said something about the white people thing. He said that he loved white people, especially when they were named William Brennan, William O. Douglas, Earl Warren, all the famous progressive Supreme Court justices who, as Onion said, made it possible for him to get a hamburger. So Onion loved those white people because they respected his rights as a black man. And so that was, you know, his feeling about white and black people. He always said, if you're white and you haven't done anything wrong in this mess that we've got, then you've got nothing to feel bad about. You don't need to feel guilty. You don't need to look at yourself as a part of the problem. You can just, you know, move on, and that's great. But if you're a white guy who is adding to the problems that black people have in this country, then you are one of the bad guys. And then he had plenty of bad things to say about you. And that's just, you know, it wasn't a matter of not liking white people. It was never a question of, you know, if your skin is white, that you're a problem. The problem was that if you were acting poorly as somebody who was using that white skin for your personal advantage, well, then he had a serious problem because you were diminishing his value. And that's how he felt.
There are a lot of people who would tell me, well, he's just a race baiter. I disagreed with that. I thought that, and again, I didn't know the man, but I listened to his broadcasts. And I wouldn't say he didn't like white people, but you could certainly understand what some of the things that he would say as to why many people thought he didn't like white people. I think that he didn't like the way most white people treated black people, because to Onion, everything was race related.
Everything.
Absolutely everything was race related.
Onion used to say that if he saw a blade of grass growing up out of the sidewalk, he could explain to you how that was a racial issue.
I think that he could.
Everything. He saw everything through that lens, and that's one of the reasons we got along so tremendously well, because we both agreed that this country has really focused all of its issues around race. And the crime against black people that started 400 years ago is unending. Onion and I both believed that. I always said that Alexis de Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, and he looked at democracy. He wrote that great book, Democracy in America. It's about that thick, big. Yeah. And he wrote the book, and about a third of the way through the book, he said, this is a great country. It's got amazing democratic institutions, but he said in 150 years, which would have been 1980s, they'll still be fighting over this because of the mess that they've made of it. And this was, again, 1830.
Yeah.
And the fact is, now we're 30 years past that, and we are still arguing about it.
And I think we always will, because I think that, but in my opinion, less so than we used to. And I think it's human nature. People are always most comfortable with those that they have most in common with. And I think that nowadays, race is playing less a part of that. Okay. It's always played a part. It will always play a part. But what Onion used to say, and I kind of thought that, in my opinion, I don't think he cared much for white people myself. I agree with most people. I don't think he really cared for white people, but it was because turnabout was fair play. In other words, look, you never liked us, so there's no reason for us to like you. And that's what I got out of it. But it's nothing personal.
Yeah. I don't think that's really the way it was. I
think you knew him better than I.
Yeah,
like I said, I was a passive listener on the radio.
I think he truly loved many white people. And the problem was distrust. It wasn't not liking them. It wasn't paying back for anything. He just knew how white people behaved in this country. And I think right now, if he were here, in fact, I can guarantee it, he would say that it hasn't improved in terms of the attitudes that exist. Sure, he can get that hamburger. Yeah, he could go in the front door of a restaurant. That law has been taken care of. But I think he would tell you, if he were here right now, that white people in this country do not like black people for all kinds of different reasons. And I think he would argue that it's no better today than it was 50, 100, or 150 years ago, that the understanding of how black people feel is simply wrong. White people just don't get it. They do not understand what it is that motivates black people in this country. And again, you mentioned that, Onion maybe didn't speak for the black community because maybe there isn't one. Mm. But again, both of us would argue exactly to the contrary, that there is an enormous black community in this country, to the point that even in the last election, 90% of black people vote for the Democrat. They just do. Now, some sat home because they didn't like Hillary a little bit. But honestly, the black community is very together in terms of their politics, in terms of their attitudes. And you also made a comment off the air, which is absolutely correct, which is that in some ways, that black community can be very conservative. Interestingly enough, even though they always vote for Democrats.
Well, that's very true.
But very conservative, certainly on the gay issue, very conservative. There's a religious streak through the black community that is very strong, which Onion totally backed away from. He had no interest in any of that religious talk at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the whole conservative thing with the church attendance, with the election, Mayor Pete will never get a large percentage, a large percentage of the black vote because he's gay, because there's a big homophobic vein that runs through many black people. I won't say the black community, but many black people. Something Onion Horton used to say, though, I wanted to mention this, and it had to do with stereotyping and stereotyping black people and white people. And I'm going to read this. This is, Louis Farrakhan and I are everything a white man wants a black man to be. We don't smoke, we don't drink, we don't chase white women or socialize outside of black neighborhoods. When he came up with statements like that, I mean, in many ways, Onion Horton loved the black community. He loved being black. He said he wanted to live he enjoyed living in the slums. That was a statement I'd read and heard him say many times. He said, I want to live with black people. I don't want to live in Chesterfield. I don't want to live in Richmond Heights. He said, but I want the schools in the neighborhood in which I live to be just as good as those schools. And that's something that you really can't argue with.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Onion would come out all the time with me to where I live in Chesterfield. Mm-hmm. And he hated it every time he came.
Why did he hate it? Too many white people?
He didn't like the atmosphere. He didn't trust that he wouldn't end up in jail. He figured he would. And in fact, I can tell you, and I know every Onion story, but I'll tell you one related to what you're talking about right now. We had advertisers in the automobile business, mm-hmm. and I would get them to give Onion a car. They were happy to. And he'd drive around with dealer plates.
That was just part of the deal.
Part of the deal.
Sure.
And so, he'd drive around with dealer plates, and he'd get picked up by the cops who would say, what's this dealer plate stuff? And see, Onion was really afraid to ride with the dealer plates because he didn't like it, mm-hmm. because he knew he was going to get stopped. And so this is one of the best ones. He got stopped somewhere in the city. They picked him up. They brought him into the police station. These were white police officers, and he was sitting in the station, arrested, presumably for stealing a car from a dealer, with stealing their plates and so forth.
Sure.
And Onion wasn't all worked up about it, but he was sitting there in the station. Because Onion wouldn't get into a big fight with somebody like that. He would do it on the air, but not personally. And in walk some black officers. And they walk in, they go, Onion Horton, how are you? What's up? And the white officers are going, you know this guy? And the black officer said, yeah, it's Onion Horton, from the radio. And they're going, what do you, the white ones, they're like, what are you talking about? What's the story? This guy may have stolen a car. And they're laughing. The black ones, they go, stole a car? You better get this guy out of here. He didn't steal anything. That's, I'm guaranteed that there's no problem. But, the white officers, yes, the stereotype perfectly. Black man driving around in a car with dealer plates has got to have stolen the car. Scared Onion to drive in those cars.
Sure. And that's something that we have in this country. Again, I think it's getting better. It's not where it needs to be, but it's certainly getting better. You're never going to have nirvana anyplace.
Yeah. If I had my black friends up here and they were in front of the microphone, every single one would agree that when they walk down the street, they can hear the door locks click.